For months, every single morning, Linda, a widowed nurse living alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains, woke up to the same soft scratching on her old front door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a skinny, injured orphan bobcat patiently returning to her porch as if this were the last place on earth that might help him. Linda had already signed all the insurance papers, planned her funeral costs, and quietly accepted that her life was just waiting out old age. But the morning she finally opened that door and let this wild creature step inside, she had no idea that he was the retirement plan life had sent to rescue her lonely heart. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The sound woke her before the alarm ever could. Not a knock, not the familiar creak of the old farmhouse settling, but a soft, steady scraping like someone dragging their fingernails down the front door. For a second, Linda Parker lay still in the dark, heart thudding, listening. The digital clock beside her bed glowed 5:17 a.m., the time most sane people in North Carolina were still under warm blankets, not wandering around on a cold mountain morning. The scratching came again, followed by a low, muffled growl. Linda pushed herself up with a small grunt. Her knees complained the way they did every day now, a reminder that Medicare coverage took care of some things, but not the way time gnawed at bone and cartilage. She slipped her feet into her slippers, pulled her robe tight across her chest, and shuffled down the short hallway toward the living room. The house was its usual early morning self. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the old wall clock, the scent of yesterday's coffee grounds still in the trash. On the small table by the front window sat the bills she'd been ignoring. Property taxes, home insurance renewal, some glossy brochure about retirement savings she hadn't bothered to open. There was no one left to talk big decisions over with. It was just her and these four walls on Maple Ridge Road. The scratching turned into a dull thump like something bumping against the door. All right, she muttered, more to calm herself than anything. I hear you. She stopped a few feet back from the door and peered through the narrow side window. At first, all she saw was gray dawn and the vague shadow of the porch rail. Then her eyes adjusted and she sucked in a breath. Right there on the welcome mat, framed in the weak light, was a bobcat kitten. It was smaller than she expected, maybe the size of a house cat, but with longer legs, big paws, and those tufted ears that stood up like little flags. Its fur, which should have been thick and glossy, was patchy and matted with mud. One ear was torn, a ragged triangle. It stood with most of its weight on 3 legs. The fourth held just off the ground, trembling, and it was staring straight at her, eyes of bright, wild gold. Well, that's not a raccoon, she whispered. The bobcat lifted one paw and pressed it to the glass of the lower window as if it knew exactly where she was. The claws clicked faintly against the pane. Linda's throat tightened. It was too young to be out here alone. Orphan, her mind supplied automatically the old emergency room triage voice, waking up after a long sleep. Underweight, dehydrated, possible infection. She felt herself lean in, her hand drifting toward the deadbolt, and then another voice rose up, sharper and far less kind. Wild, dangerous, illegal to fee. You are not 35 anymore, Linda. For a heartbeat she saw another doorway, another morning, paramedics wheeling a covered body out while she stood on the porch clutching a cup of coffee that had gone stone cold, her husband's slippers still by the bed. The way her world had dropped out from under her in one quiet, ordinary second. She had sworn, standing there in her frayed bathrobe with neighbors watching, that she was done letting anything close enough to break her again. The bobcat pressed closer, fogging the glass with its breath. "Where is your mother, sweetheart?" she murmured, almost without meaning to. It blinked slowly, swayed on its feet. The fourth leg shook harder now. There was a dark smear on the mat under it. Blood. Linda's hand finally moved, but not to the lock. She reached instead for the phone on the little entry table, the one with big buttons she'd bought after her eyes started to give her trouble. Her fingers hesitated over the contacts for a moment, then tapped the number she'd put under Wildlife. It rang twice. A man's voice answered, thick with sleep. "Ramirez." "Marcus, it's Linda up on Maple Ridge," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. There's a bobcat on my porch. A baby, I think. It's hurt." There was a pause, sheets rustling on the other end. "On your porch? Like, right now?" "Yes, looking right at me." She swallowed. "It doesn't look good." He exhaled, the sound crackling through the line. "Don't open that door. You hear me, Ms. Parker? Don't feed it. Don't touch it. Don't talk to it. I'll be there in 20. "It's freezing out," she protested, glancing at the thin fur, the way the kitten hunched against the cold. Frost feathered the edges of the glass. "It's just a baby." "A wild baby," he said firmly. "You give it food or shelter, you teach it people mean safety. Next thing you know, it's in somebody's yard with their dog or their grandkid. That's how accidents happen. Stay back. I'm on my way." She hung up, heart hammering harder now, but she didn't move farther from the window. Instead, she slid down, leaning her shoulder against the frame until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, knees drawn up, the silly old robe bunched around her ankles. On the other side of the glass, the bobcat slowly sank down too, curling its body so that its good front paw still touched the cold pane between them. They stared, oars at oars, each other in the growing light. Linda became aware of the ache in her own chest, the familiar loneliness that sat just under her ribs like a stone. She'd spent the last few months reading about home security systems, life insurance policies, reverse mortgage offers that arrived like clockwork in her mailbox, all reminders that the world expected her to think about endings, not beginnings. No one had looked at her like they needed her in a very long time. Headlights finally swept across the front of the house, breaking the moment. A white state truck bumped up the gravel drive. The bobcat flinched, ears flattening. A tall man in a green jacket climbed out, pulling on gloves as he walked up the steps. "Back away from the door, Ms. Parker," Ramirez called gently but firmly. She did as he said, retreating to the hallway. She watched from the side window as he used his body to block the bobcat from the door, voice low but commanding, waving his arms, making himself big. The kitten tried to hold its ground for a second, then finally turned and limped down the steps, disappearing into the thin trees at the edge of her yard. Ramirez followed it a little way, making sure it didn't circle right back, then returned, his breath white in the cold air. He knocked. When she opened the door a crack, the dawn chill slipped in around him. "I'll set a live trap down by the creek," he said. "But you can't have animals like that thinking this porch is a safe place, for their sake and yours." Linda nodded, though something in her wilted. "It was hurt," she said softly. "Somebody should help it." "That's what I'm trying to do," he replied. "Best thing you can do is not make it tame." He tipped his hat, then turned back toward his truck. When she finally closed the door and locked it, the house felt even quieter than before. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. In the thin light spreading across the porch, something caught her eye. She opened the door again, just enough to look down. Right on the edge of the welcome mat, a small, rust-colored smear stained the wood where the bobcat had stood, and tiny drops of blood marked a shaky trail down the steps toward the trees. Linda stared at that dark line, her fingers tightening around the doorframe, and for the first time in a long while she felt that old emergency room instinct rising up in her chest, hot and insistent, refusing to be ignored. The next morning the porch was clean, but Linda carried the sight of that blood with her like a stone in her pocket. She'd scrubbed it herself at first light, on her knees with an old dish rag and a cereal bowl full of warm water, working until the rusty smear faded from the welcome mat and step. When she finally straightened, her back stiff and knees popping, there was nothing left to see. But as she stood at the sink pouring out the pinkish water, she could still picture those tiny drops trailing toward the trees, as if the woods had reached a paw in and taken the injured thing back. By 7 o'clock she was at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the TV murmuring in the corner. A bright morning host talked about rising prescription drug costs, Medicare Advantage enrollment deadlines, and a new scam where thieves drained seniors' retirement accounts through fake online banking apps. Linda half listened, half shuffled through the mail she'd neglected the night before. Property tax bill. A glossy flyer about refinancing your mortgage before rates go up. A cheerful envelope promising a simple life insurance policy for folks over 60. All of it assumed the same thing, that people like her spent their days thinking about endings. How to pay for them. How not to be a burden. Nobody ever mailed a brochure explaining what to do when you were still here, healthy enough to drive and do your own dishes. But nobody really needed you anymore. There had been a time when she'd never sat still this long. For more than 3 decades at the hospital in Atlanta, she'd been Nurse Parker. She'd lived under fluorescent lights and the constant beep of monitors, moving from room to room with a chart in one hand and a cup of terrible coffee in the other. She could slide an IV into a vein in the back of a moving ambulance, talk a hysterical mother through bad news, and bark at a resident to order a CT scan, all in the same breath. Stress was a given, but so was purpose. Every shift, somebody's life quite literally depended on her showing up. Then came the morning her husband hit the kitchen floor. The memory was sharp and blurry all at once. One minute he was grumbling about indigestion and whether they should switch car insurance companies. The next he was pale and sweating, words slurring as his knees buckled. She'd done compressions until her arms shook, ridden in the back of the ambulance not as a nurse, but as a wife, watched younger hands work the code. Under the same lights she'd worked beneath for years, someone else called the time. Massive stroke, nothing to be done. After the funeral, the house in Atlanta felt wrong. His recliner sat empty in the den. His shoes still waited by the door. She found herself making 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then pouring one down the sink. Friends from work brought casseroles and advice about grief counseling. Megan called every evening at first, her voice tight with worry from 3 states away. "You could move in with us, Mom," she offered more than once. Linda thanked her and changed the subject. She couldn't imagine squeezing herself and her memories into a spare bedroom between soccer practice and school pickups. Retirement followed close on the heels of loss. Her knees ached on the long shifts. New managers wanted younger faces on the front lines. When she finally turned in her notice, they threw a party with sheet cake and a slideshow of old photos. Her with big 80s hair, her in, scrubs 2 sizes smaller, always in motion. They gave her a plaque and a gift card and told her she had earned time to relax. She walked out to the parking lot carrying a cardboard box and felt more untethered than free. The cabin in Blue Ridge had started as a late-night listing on her laptop. A small house with a metal roof and a deep front porch tucked into the trees at the end of a gravel road. Perfect retirement getaway, the ad promised, right above a banner for low-interest credit cards and senior-friendly financial planning. It looked like someplace quiet where nobody would need anything at 3 in the morning. At the time, that sounded like heaven. Within a year, she'd sold the Atlanta house and made the move. Megan fretted over the paperwork and asked whether her mom had the right home insurance and enough saved in her retirement account. Linda nodded through it all, signed where the lawyer pointed, and watched as a lifetime of furniture and dishes and photographs shrank down into a few labeled boxes. When she finally stood alone in the Blue Ridge living room, the echo of her own footsteps was the loudest sound. At first, the quiet felt clean. No sirens, no overhead pages, no families crying in hallways. Boys. Nights up here were truly dark, the sky full of more stars than she'd seen since she was a girl. The two scruffy barn cats who came with the property adopted her quickly, twisting around her legs at feeding time and curling on the porch rail like little sentries. She settled into a narrow little routine, up before dawn, coffee, local news, a slow walk to the mailbox, whether there was mail or not. Her nearest neighbor, Ruby Jenkins, lived a bit down the hill in a double wide, with plastic flowers stuck in the dirt and a flag that changed with every holiday. Ruby's daughter worked odd hours at the Dollar General in town, so it was usually Ruby and her 8-year-old grandson Ethan out in the yard. Ethan rode his bike up and down Maple Ridge Road, helmet crooked, legs pumping, always waving when he saw Linda's car. She waved back from behind the windshield or from the mailbox, promising herself she'd invite them up for lemonade one of these days. One of these days kept not happening. Most evenings she called Megan, listened to grandkids argue in the background about homework and screen time, and said all the right and sounds fun replies. When she hung up, the house fell back into its deep, familiar hush. The only things that depended on her now were the cats and the plants on the windowsill. That first night after the bobcat came, the hush felt different, less like peace and more like something holding its breath. She went to bed early but slept poorly, drifting in and out of thin dreams. Once she jolted awake, certain she'd heard scratching at the door, only to realize it was a tree branch tapping the siding in the wind. Close to midnight, she gave up on sleep and padded out to the kitchen for a glass of water. The clock on the stove glowed 12:07. The world outside the windows was black and still. On her way back down the hall, she hesitated by the front window. It was silly, she told herself, but her fingers still found the edge of the curtain and eased it back an inch. Moonlight washed the porch in silver. The mat lay flat. The rocker, her husband's old one she'd brought from Atlanta, sat empty and still. The step where she'd scrubbed that smear of blood was clean and pale. No small form huddled there, no golden eyes staring in. Of course not, she thought. Officer Ramirez had driven it off. Wild things belonged in the woods. She started to let the curtain fall, then saw something at the very edge of the steps. Leaning closer, she narrowed her eyes until the blur sharpened. In the thin dusting of frost on the gravel below the porch was the clear outline of a paw print. 4 toes, 1 pad, bigger than a house cat's, smaller than a dog's, fresh. Linda stood there with the curtain bunched in her hand, her heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. Out in the dark line of trees, something moved too quietly for her to hear. But she felt it anyway, the way you feel a storm coming long before you see lightning. The house did not seem quite as empty as it had the week before. She let the curtain fall and went back to bed. When she finally drifted off, it wasn't hospital light she saw behind her eyelids, but dawn light on fur and a small herding animal standing on her porch, as if it believed, against all odds, that she was the one person on this mountain who might help. The next morning, Linda woke before the alarm again, not from a sound this time, but from the feeling that something was waiting. It was still dark enough that the room had no edges. She lay there a moment, listening to the old house breathe, then finally sighed and swung her legs over the side of the bed. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered to herself, slipping on her robe. Wild animals don't make appointments. Still, when she walked down the hallway, she didn't go straight to the coffee pot. She turned first toward the front window, fingers already finding the edge of the curtain. A cold, blue-gray light seeped in from outside. She pulled the fabric back just enough to peek out. He was there. The little bobcat sat right on the welcome mat, as neat as if someone had placed him there. His fur still looked rough, but she thought he might be standing a bit more solidly on that bad leg. Frost dusted his whiskers. His ears flicked once as if he'd heard her, and those gold eyes found her face through the glass like they'd been waiting for her all along. "Oh, honey," she breathed before she could stop herself. He lifted one paw and tapped the lower pane again, that tiny, soft clicking of claw on glass, like a child asking to be let in. The spot where the blood had been yesterday was almost clean now, just a faint stain in the wood. He stood right over it as if he knew. Linda stayed rooted there for a long moment, hand resting on the window frame. Marcus's warning echoed in her mind. You give it food or shelter, you teach it people mean safety. Her years in emergency medicine added their own cold layer. You start crossing lines you swore you wouldn't, one small exception at a time, and pretty soon you can't remember where the rule even was. She forced herself to let the curtain fall and turned toward the kitchen. The cats twined around her ankles, complaining that breakfast was late. She fed them, started the coffee, turned on the local news. Some serious-looking man in a suit talked about inflation, cost of groceries, and how to compare car insurance quotes online. An ad promised low-interest credit cards for seniors with good payment history. The words washed past her without landing. She tried not to look at the front door. She failed. By the time she gave in and checked again, the bobcat was curled up on the mat, tail wrapped around his body, head tucked down. If not for the fog of his breath on the glass, she might have thought he was gone. The day passed in a strange loop. Now and then he would rise, limp a few circles as if to get feeling back in his limbs, then settle again, always with his face angled toward the house. Whenever Linda walked past the window, his ears twitched. When the mail truck rumbled up the road around noon, he flattened himself against the porch boards, then popped back up the moment it was gone. "Stubborn little thing," she said under her breath. That afternoon, a car she recognized came grinding up the hill. Ruby's old sedan wheezed to a stop at the bottom of Linda's drive. Ruby got out, wrapped in a bright pink sweatshirt and tight-lipped determination. Ethan trotted beside her in a superhero t-shirt, clutching a tablet. Linda stepped onto the porch, pulling the door almost closed behind her. The bobcat lifted his head, but didn't move away. His eyes tracked Ruby with a lazy, wary interest. "Linda, have you lost your mind?" Ruby said by way of greeting, pointing an accusatory finger at the animal. "You have a wild cat sitting on your porch like it pays the mortgage." "I didn't invite him," Linda replied. "He just keeps showing up." "Yeah, and the bears just show up to the dumpster," Ruby snapped. "Doesn't mean you set out a casserole. Ethan, stay back." Ethan's eyes were huge. "Is it a lynx?" he whispered. "Bobcat," Linda said automatically. "Lynx are farther north." Ethan raised the tablet. "Can I take a video? My friends are never going to believe this." Ruby rolled her eyes but didn't stop him. "You better not be feeding that thing," she said. "I saw a story on Facebook about a woman got sued after a deer she fed ran into a car. Some attorney said it made her responsible. You don't want that kind of trouble when you're living on Social Security and about towards little retirement." "I'm not feeding it," Linda lied, because she hadn't yet, not really. "Officer Ramirez came up. He told me the rules." "Good," Ruby sniffed, "because if that thing comes down near my yard with Ethan out back, somebody's going to call more than just a wildlife officer. Folks don't mess around with home protection up here." She gave the bobcat one last wary glare. "You call somebody and get it moved, Linda, before something bad happens." After they left, the quiet poured back over the porch. Ethan's video had captured the bobcat lifting his head, ears perked, the mountains behind him painted in winter colors. It would be online before dinner, Linda had no doubt. The world had a way of finding things like this. Viral, they called it, like a flu. 2 days later, there was a knock on the door that was firm, official. Linda opened it to find Marcus Ramirez again, this time with a metal cage in the back of his truck. "Morning, Ms. Parker," he said, glancing past her shoulder toward the mat. The bobcat was there, as expected, sitting like a small, wild statue. "He's gotten comfortable, hasn't he?" "He hasn't touched anything," Linda said defensively. "He just sits. That's the problem." Marcus trudged up the steps, the boards creaking under his boots. "We got calls, your neighbor. A couple of folks who saw that video she posted. The department doesn't like the idea of a habituated bobcat on somebody's porch. I'm supposed to set a live trap down near the creek, try to relocate him deeper into the park. Will that help him?" she asked quietly. Marcus paused, then shrugged. "It's better than what happens if he scratches somebody's kid or gets hungry enough to go after somebody's dog. You know that." She did. In the ER, they'd seen what happened when wildlife and people collided. Dog bites, sure, but also deer through windshields, panicked raccoons tearing up arms, a man once who'd tried to take a selfie with a swan and ended up needing 20 stitches. The state had to think in terms of liability and public safety, not hurt feelings. Still, as Marcus walked back to his truck, rustle of chains and metal strong in the cold air, Linda watched the bobcat fix his gaze on the retreating man. When Marcus drove off, the truck's taillights glowing red as it disappeared down the hill, the little animal stood, favoring his sore leg, and limped to the edge of the porch. To her surprise, he didn't head straight for the woods. Instead, he slipped down the steps and followed the gravel drive, nose low, moving slowly but with purpose. At the bottom of the hill, he paused where the track met the road, then turned in the same direction Marcus's truck had gone, small shape swallowed up in the gray morning. Linda pressed a hand to the glass, watching until she couldn't see him anymore. "Go on then," she whispered. "Go find somewhere safe." That night, she slept a little deeper, telling herself the problem had quite literally walked away. In the morning, out of habit more than hope, she went to the front window and pulled back the curtain. There he was, sitting on the mat as if he had never left, tail curled neatly around his paws, frost on his whiskers, eyes steady on the door. He had followed the truck, she realized with a chill, and then found his way back. This wasn't random wandering. Out of all the porches, all the cabins and trailers scattered along Maple Ridge Road, this orphan bobcat had chosen hers and was refusing, very politely and very stubbornly, to give it up. The cold settled in overnight like a decision. When Linda eased out of bed that morning, the air in the bedroom had that sharp metallic bite that told her the thermostat hadn't quite kept up. Her breath puffed faintly in front of her face as she pulled her robe around her and shuffled down the hall. She didn't even pretend she was headed for the coffee pot first. Her feet carried her straight to the front window. She pinched back the curtain and peered out into a world washed pale blue by the just breaking dawn. He was there, of course, but this time something was different. The little bobcat was not sitting prim and upright on the mat. He was hunched low, his body a tight, miserable comma against the door. Frost sparkled on his fur like dusted sugar. When he lifted his head at the movement of the curtain, she saw that his breath came in short, rough puffs, and that injured hind leg he'd been favoring was now swollen, the fur stretched shiny over angry red skin. A thin thread of pus crusted in the fur around a small puncture wound. "Oh, God," she whispered. He tried to shift his weight, and the leg simply folded. He let out a sound then, a rasping, broken thing that wasn't quite a meow or a growl. It was the sound of something worn down past pride. Linda's mind did what it had always done in emergencies. Fever risk, infection, sepsis. She saw charts that weren't there, heard phantom monitors beeping, felt that old practiced surge of adrenaline. Out here on a mountain, there were no ER doctors, no pharmacy down the hall, just her, a half-stocked medicine cabinet, and an animal that had chosen her porch as its last good idea. "You shouldn't even be here," she said softly, as if he could understand words and not just tone. "You should be halfway up a ridge, chasing rabbits." He blinked slowly, and she caught again that awful, steady trust in those wild eyes. It was the same look she'd seen on so many gurneys, a stranger's faith that you might be the one person in the room who could make things better. She thought of Marcus saying, "Don't touch it, don't feed it, don't talk to it." She thought of Ruby, worried about Ethan and lawsuits. On the muted TV in the corner, a commercial had been playing the day before for a personal injury attorney, promising big settlements for folks hurt on someone else's property. The world was full of warnings now about liability, about home insurance exclusions, about how one wrong decision could chew through a retirement account in a heartbeat. But none of those voices were standing in front of this door. Her knees popped as she straightened. She turned away from the window and went to the kitchen on autopilot, not daring to think too hard about what she was doing. The cats twined around her legs as she opened the cabinet where she kept their dry food, then the fridge for the leftover chicken breast she'd baked 2 nights ago. She chopped it into small pieces, mixed it with kibble, and poured the whole thing into an old ceramic bowl with a chip on the rim. At the threshold, she hesitated. Cold air knifed in through the narrow opening when she cracked the door. The bobcat flinched, muscles tensing, but he didn't bolt. He watched her hands with an almost human intensity. "I'm not supposed to do this," she murmured. "So you better make it count, sweetheart." She slid the bowl out with her foot, setting it down on the mat, and nudging it closer with her toes. For one heartbeat, bobcat and woman were only arm's length apart, separated by a thin strip of air. She could smell him, damp earth, old leaves, the musky tang of wild animal. Then she pulled the door shut and retreated to the window. He didn't leap at the food the way a starving dog might. Instead, he edged forward, sniffed, then began to eat in quick, neat bites, as if he understood that this kindness was fragile and could vanish. His good back leg trembled with the effort of holding his weight. A few minutes later, the bowl was licked clean. He backed away, then, to her surprise, circled twice and lay down again just inches from the empty dish. Not leaving, she thought. Not done. By mid-morning, word had gotten around. She saw Ruby's car, creeping past slower than usual, saw the way her neighbor's eyes narrowed at the sight of the empty bowl on the porch. That afternoon, Linda's phone rang, the name Ruby flashing on the screen. "Linda, I just got off Facebook," Ruby began without preamble. "That video Ethan took? People are commenting up a storm. Half of them think it's cute. The other half are talking about rabies and saying you're crazy. One lady tagged some wildlife group, and another one tagged her brother, who's an attorney in Asheville." "People talk," Linda said tiredly. "They'll move on to something else tomorrow." "This isn't a funny cat clip," Ruby insisted. "You can't be feeding that thing. I saw the bowl. If it hurts somebody, they could come after you. You worked your whole life for that little retirement. You want to lose it because of some wild cat?" Linda looked down at her hands, the faint tremor that had started there in the past year. "He's hurt," she said simply. "I couldn't just stand here and watch." "Well, I called the state office," Ruby admitted. "North Carolina Wildlife or whoever. Sent that video and everything. They said they'd review the situation, so don't be surprised if you get something in the mail." "Of course you did," Linda said softly, but there was no real heat in it. Ruby was who she was, nervous, mouthy, and in her own way trying to protect her family. The letter came 2 days later, in an official-looking envelope shoved in with the usual stack of junk mail and offers for Medicare supplement plans and affordable whole life insurance. Linda sat at the table, the bobcat visible through the window at her shoulder, and read it line by careful line. The language was stiff and polite, but the message was clear. Residents are prohibited from intentionally feeding or harboring wild predators, including but not limited to bobcats. Such actions may result in animals becoming habituated to humans, increasing the risk of property damage or personal injury. In documented cases where relocation is not effective, euthanasia may be required for public safety. Euthanasia. They didn't even bother to say, "put down," just the cold, clinical word she'd seen on medical forms and pet clinic posters. At the bottom was a warning about fines for non-compliance and a reminder that failure to follow wildlife regulations may impact eligibility for certain homeowners' insurance protections. Linda set the paper down. Her gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the little bobcat lifted his head, as if sensing her eyes on him. He blinked once, slow and solemn, then rested his chin back on his paws. She realized, with a sick twist in her gut, that by breaking the rules to help him, she might have just signed his death warrant. The storm rolled in just after dark, a low grumble that turned into a full-throated roar as the night went on. Rain hammered the metal roof in waves. Wind clawed at the eaves, making the old house shudder. At some point the lights flickered, then snapped off for good, leaving Linda standing in her kitchen with a flashlight beam and the hum of the refrigerator dying in her ears. "Well, there goes the grid," she muttered, setting a fat candle on the table and striking a match. The glow pushed back just enough darkness to make the shadows look alive. She checked on the cats, both stuffed under the couch with bottle brush tails, then wandered to the front window, more out of habit than hope. Thunder rattled the glass. Rain streaked the pane so hard she could barely see the porch. "He's not out there," she told herself firmly. "Even a bobcat's got enough sense to get under a rock in this mess." Lightning flashed, a sudden white sheet that lit up the yard like midday. In that split second, she saw nothing on the mat, nothing on the steps, only the empty rocker bucking a little in the wind. When the darkness slammed back down, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was halfway back to the kitchen when she heard it, a heavy thump right against the front door, not the light, polite scratching of the past mornings. This was the sound of something falling. Her heart leaped. She grabbed the flashlight and hurried back, the rubber soles of her slippers whispering against the floor. Another sound came, a raw, broken yowl that cut through the storm. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, fingers fumbling at the deadbolt. She opened the door just enough to angle the beam of light out. Rain blew in sideways, cold and stinging. The bobcat was crumpled against the threshold, half on the mat and half on the wet boards. Mud and blood had turned his coat into a dark, tangled mess. The infected leg was grotesquely swollen now, oozing from a torn place where something, another animal, a trap she couldn't tell, had ripped the skin open wider. He tried to drag himself upright when the door opened, front paws scrabbling weakly. But the bad leg betrayed him, and he slid back down, chest heaving. His eyes met hers, dazed and glassy, but there was recognition there. Familiar. "Found you." Rain spattered her face. Thunder cracked overhead. Behind her, the candle on the table guttered in the draft. Every warning she'd heard seemed to shout at once. The letter from the wildlife office, Marcus's voice on the phone. Ruby talking about lawsuits and insurance companies that wouldn't pay out if you broke the rules. She thought about how one wrong move could wipe out what was left of her savings, how she'd worked too long to end up drowning in medical debt and credit card interest this late in life. Then she looked down again at that small, broken body on her doorstep. "All right, kid," she said hoarsely. "You win." She shoved the door wider and stepped back. For a moment the bobcat didn't move, as if he didn't quite believe the path was open. Then he gathered what was left of his strength and dragged himself over the threshold, claws scritching on the wood, leaving a smear of muddy water and blood behind. He collapsed just inside, sides heaving, head lolling toward the glow of the wood stove in the corner. Linda shut the door against the rain and slid the deadbolt home. The house felt suddenly smaller, every shadow sharper. A wild animal lay on her living room floor. "Don't do anything stupid," she told him and herself in the same breath. Training took over. She fetched the old pet carrier from the hall closet, not to use. He'd never fit, and he'd shred her for trying, but because it held a box of supplies she'd never quite gotten around to throwing away. An ancient bottle of chlorhexidine wash, rolls of gauze, a packet of syringes still in sterile wrap, left over from when she'd helped a neighbor with their diabetic dog. In the bathroom she grabbed a pair of heavy rubber gloves and the little flashlight she used to check her own water meter. When she came back, the bobcat hadn't moved much. His ears tracked her, but he seemed too exhausted to lift his head. She crouched a few feet away, knees complaining, and studied the leg. The smell of infection hit her first. Hot, sickly, sweet. The same odor she'd known too well in human wounds. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. "Both of us." She tossed a thick bath towel over his head, more for his comfort than any real protection. He tensed, a low rumble starting deep in his chest, but he didn't explode into claws the way an uninjured animal might have. Moving as gently as her old hands allowed, she cleaned around the wound, flushing away dirt and pus until she could see the angry torn flesh. Something had punctured deep. A bite, maybe, or a piece of wire. He growled louder when she probed, muscles twitching under her grip. Once his jaws snapped blindly, teeth clacking shut inches from her forearm. Her heart stuttered, but she held on. "Easy, easy," she murmured, the same tone she'd used on frightened children and panicked car crash victims. "I know, sweetheart, I know it hurts." From the medicine cabinet she'd brought a broad-spectrum antibiotic she kept on hand for her own emergencies, left over from a bout of pneumonia a few winters back when she hadn't wanted to sit in an urgent care waiting room for hours under harsh lights. She calculated the dose in her head, body weight to milligrams, the way she'd done 1,000 times before for patients and pets. Not perfect, not textbook, but better than nothing. "Last part," she told him, sliding the needle into the least swollen patch of muscle she could find. "Then you can rest." He jerked at the sting, a guttural yowl punching out from under the towel. One hind paw lashed, claws catching the edge of a throw rug and yanking it sideways. The house cats, who'd been hiding behind the couch with their fur puffed, shot down the hall like furry missiles. When it was done, she sat back on her heels, breathless. The towel settled as his breathing slowed. The gurgle of his growl faded to a low, steady rumble that almost sounded like a purr, though she knew better than to trust that. Outside, the storm began to move on. The thunder grew more distant. Rain softened from a roar to a patter. In the dim candlelight, with the flashlight propped on a chair, the scene looked almost peaceful. An old woman in a worn flannel robe, a wild bobcat asleep on her living room floor. "I must be out of my mind," she said aloud, but there was a strange, fierce warmth in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she'd done something that mattered. She dozed in the armchair, waking every so often to check his breathing, the way she once had with critical patients in the ER. Sometime near dawn, the lights blinked back on. She startled, blinking against the sudden brightness. The bobcat's ears flicked, but he didn't rise. A truck pulled into the drive just as the coffee pot finished gurgling. She recognized the sound even before she glanced out the window and saw the state logo on the door. Marcus climbed out, squinting up at the house, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. Linda met him on the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. He looked tired, as if he'd been out all night checking downed power lines and stranded deer. "Storm give you any trouble?" he asked, but his gaze was already sliding past her shoulder. "How's our little porch squatter?" She swallowed. "You should probably come in." He gave her a sharp, searching look, then stepped through the doorway. For a second he just stood there, taking in the sight. The bobcat lay on the rug in front of the wood stove, bandaged legs stretched out, towel half kicked off. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. Syringe wrappers and gauze scraps sat in a neat pile on the coffee table. "Jesus, Ms. Parker," he breathed. "You brought it inside. He wouldn't have made it to town," she said quietly. "Not in that storm. Not on that leg." Marcus dragged a hand down his face. "You know I'm supposed to call this in. I'm supposed to get a tranquilizer gun, haul him to a rehab center, put a big red flag on your address in the system." "I know what the rules say," Linda said. "I also know what septic shock looks like." He was headed there. Marcus crouched carefully, keeping a respectable distance. The bobcat opened one eye, regarded him without moving, then closed it again. "Bandage is good," Marcus admitted grudgingly. "Damn good, actually. You missed this window. Infection like that can take an animal down fast." "I didn't miss it," she said. "Not yet." He rocked back on his heels, exhaling. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Outside, the last of the rain tapped softly on the roof. The refrigerator hummed back to life, one more ordinary sound in a not-so-ordinary morning. "Here's the thing," he said finally. "If I file this the way I'm supposed to, a supervisor who's never set foot on Maple Ridge is going to look at your address and that letter they sent you and make a decision from behind a desk. Odds are not in this little guy's favor. They see habituated predator. They think risk. Risk gets removed." Linda's mouth went dry. "So what are you going to do?" Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, the tired eyes, the steady hands, the way she positioned herself just slightly between him and the injured animal without even realizing it. He sighed. "I'm going to pretend I didn't see him in your living room," he said. "I'm going to say the storm knocked a tree across the road and I couldn't get up here last night to check. And I'm going to give you 1 week." "1 week," she repeated. "You work your nurse magic," he said. "You get that infection turned around, get him back on 4 legs. Then the door opens and he goes back outside where he belongs. You don't keep him as a pet. You don't post cute videos. You don't invite the grandkids over for show and tell. You let him be what he is." "A bobcat," she murmured. "A wild bobcat," he corrected. "If I see any sign he's getting too comfortable with people, or if there's one complaint about him down the road, this deal's over. I'll be back with traps and a tranquilizer, and I won't be able to look the other way." She nodded slowly. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd opened that door last night. Behind them came a sudden, rough sound. They both turned just in time to see the bobcat, roused by voices and smells, push himself up on his front legs. He shook the towel off his head with an irritated growl and tried to rise fully. The bad leg buckled. In frustration, he snapped his jaws at the nearest movement, a blur of fur as one of Linda's house cats made the mistake of dashing past. The little cat streaked by just out of reach. Rusty's teeth clicked shut on empty air. His growl rolled through the room, deep and raw, vibrating in Linda's ribs. Marcus straightened, eyes hard. "That," he said quietly, "is why we can't forget what he is." Linda's heart pounded, but she stepped forward anyway, voice low and steady, the way you'd talk to someone teetering on the edge of panic. "Easy, sweetheart. You're all right. You're safe." The bobcat looked at her, the wild light in his eyes dimming by a fraction. He let his head lower back to the rug, chest rising and falling in slower, more even breaths. Marcus watched the two of them, then shook his head like a man who knew he'd just talked himself into something he couldn't quite explain. 1 week, he repeated. Then that door opens again. Linda glanced at the bandaged leg, the golden eyes, the space between them that had just gotten much, much smaller. 1 week, she agreed. The week Marcus had given her slid by in a blur of small rituals and careful distance. By the second day, the fever had eased. The angry heat around the wound cooled under the antibiotics. The swelling began to go down, slowly, like air leaking out of a tire. Rusty, she started calling him that in her head because of the reddish cast of his fur, ate what she set down without fuss, then curled near the wood stove to sleep, a tight coil of muscle and spots. She kept rules, for his sake and hers. No touching unless it was for treatment, no hand-feeding, no calling his name like he was a pet. She moved calmly around him, talking in that low, steady nurse's voice about coffee and electric bills and how Social Security never seemed to stretch quite far enough now that groceries and home insurance had both gone up in the same year. It didn't matter what she said, it was the tone that made him lift his head and listen. The house cats watched all this from the high ground of the bookcase and top of the refrigerator, offended and fascinated in equal measure. Once the braver one tried to sneak a sniff at him while he slept. Rusty opened one eye, gave a rumble that shook the floorboards, and the cat rethought its life choices. By day 4, he was putting a little weight on the bad leg. The bandage stayed cleaner between changes. His eyes were bright again, tracking every movement with that sharp, wild awareness. When she leaned in to check the stitches she'd put in, his whiskers twitched against the back of her gloved hand, and she felt the strength coiled just under the skin. "You're not mine," she reminded him quietly. "You don't belong on anybody's couch." The morning the bandage came off for good, the air had that thawing bite that meant spring wasn't far off. Linda sat on the rug with her knees screaming and snipped the last bit of tape. Rusty licked at the bare leg, testing the feel of it, then rose carefully to his feet. For the first time since he'd fallen through her door in the storm, he stood on all fours without collapsing. He took 3 steps, then 5, turned, slinked around the coffee table, every muscle flowing the way a bobcat shoaled. At the far wall he paused to sniff a framed picture of her and her late husband in front of their old brick house in Atlanta, then glanced back at her as if to say, "This is your territory, not mine." "I guess there's our answer," she said. She would have liked to keep him longer, to pretend that the risky, impossible arrangement they were living in, this strange little wildlife rehab center that was really just her living room, could go on forever. But Marcus's deadline hung over her, as tangible as the pink notice on her last power bill and the fine print on her Medicare Advantage policy. That afternoon, she opened the front door and left it standing wide. Rusty sat by the stove for a long moment, watching the rectangle of light on the floor. A breeze carried in the scents of dirt and pine, and something small scurrying in the underbrush. His ears twitched. "Go on," Linda said softly. "You did your part. I did mine. Time to get back to whatever a bobcat's supposed to do up there." He padded toward the door, steps slow but steady. On the threshold he paused, looking out at the yard, the gravel drive, the shaggy fringe of trees beyond. Then he turned his head and looked back at her. For a second, their eyes met. Her worn gray-blue gaze and his clear, wild gold. Her chest hurt in the way it had when she'd watched her daughter walk into the airport security line with a college suitcase for the first time. "You're going to be just fine," she told him, more to convince herself than him. He blinked once, slow, deliberate, and then he was gone, slipping into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. The house felt very big that night. She left the door closed but not locked until long after dark, listening without admitting she was listening. The old clock ticked. The weather report droned on the TV about storms in other states, about rising flood insurance costs along the coast. Her phone buzzed with a spam call about lowering your credit card debt with one simple program. She let it go to voicemail. Rusty did not come back the next morning. Or the next. The porch sat empty except for the rocker and the cats sunning themselves. The welcome mat dried. The jagged little stains from his first visits faded. Good, she told herself briskly, pouring coffee. That's what's supposed to happen. On the fourth morning, she woke again with that prickling sense of being watched. She padded to the window, heart doing that foolish trip in her chest, and there he was. He stood in the yard, just off the porch, not on the mat this time, but in the damp grass. He looked different, sleeker somehow, his coat brushed by the forest, not house air. The healed leg bore his weight with no sign of pain. For a moment her relief was simple and clean. Then she saw what he had in his mouth. It dangled from his jaws, small and limp, gray fur soaked from dew. Linda's stomach dropped. "Oh no," she whispered. "Don't you bring me dead things, kid. We've got enough drama." Rusty stepped forward and carefully set the bundle down on the bottom step. It flopped to one side and let out the faintest, thinnest squeak. It was a kitten, a scrawny little scrap of a tabby, ribs like a washboard under patchy fur. One hind leg stuck out at an angle that made her wince. Its sides fluttered with shallow breaths. Its eyes, crusted and half-closed, rolled blindly until they found the open doorway. Rusty backed up 2 steps and sat, tail curled neatly around his paws. He looked from the kitten to Linda, then back again, as if waiting. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she said, but her hands were already reaching for a towel. She scooped the little thing up and carried it inside, the old triage voice in her head switching on. Shocky. Possibly dehydrated. Fracture, maybe dislocation. Fleas jumping like popcorn. She'd done worse with less. Warmth first, then fluids, then see about that leg. As she worked at the sink, she caught a glimpse of movement at the window. Rusty, still sitting where she'd left him, watching. "You think I'm running a free clinic now?" she called through the glass. "Is that it?" He flicked an ear and stayed put until she finished splinting the tiny leg and wrapping the kitten in a soft cloth. Only then did he turn and melt into the woods, as silent as mist. It didn't stop with the kitten. Over the next week, a battered parade found its way to her porch, always with Rusty hovering somewhere nearby. A young rabbit with a mangled paw. A possum with a nasty gash along its side. A bluebird dragging a wing, eyes bright with panic. Each one arrived at her doorstep in the dawn or dusk, sometimes carried, sometimes herded. Each time, Rusty held back just far enough to make it clear this wasn't begging. It felt more like referrals. Word went around town about Maple Ridge Road again, this time not on Facebook, but in murmurs at the diner and whispers in the pharmacy line. An old man at the feed store told her he'd heard that lady with the bobcat was some kind of animal whisperer. The clerk at the grocery store asked half-jokingly if she took appointments for misbehaving dogs, then offered her a coupon for senior discounts on pet food. One Saturday morning, just as she was syringe-feeding a bit of watered-down kitten formula to the tabby, she heard tires crunching on gravel. Marcus's truck pulled up out front, sunlight glinting off the state emblem on the door. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't sure which she was more worried about, the animals in her living room or the stack of official-looking mail still sitting unopened under the sugar bowl. She opened the door before he could knock. "If you're here about my extended guest list," she said dryly, "you're a little late." He stepped in and stopped short. The kitten was in a box by the stove, tiny nose peeking out from the blanket. The rabbit dozed in a crate with a clean bandage on its leg. The bluebird perched in a laundry basket rigged with mesh, feathers fluffed. "What in the world?" he began. A shadow passed the doorway. Ethan burst in without knocking, cheeks flushed, Ruby right behind him. "Mrs. Parker, have you seen—" he started, then spotted the menagerie. "Whoa!" Ruby grabbed his shoulder. "I told you to wait by the car." Before Linda could answer, a familiar shape appeared at the edge of the yard. Rusty, moving low and fast, something clamped carefully in his jaws. Linda's heart lurched. "Please don't let it be somebody's chicken," she muttered. It wasn't. As he reached the porch, she saw a small tan dog hanging in his grip, legs kicking weakly. Rusty laid it down on the mat with surprising gentleness. The dog's collar glinted in the light. "Daisy!" Ethan yelped, lunging forward. Ruby grabbed him tighter. The little dog whimpered, trying to drag itself forward. One front leg trailed uselessly. A thin wire snare dangled from it, biting deep into the flesh. Linda's world narrowed to a familiar tunnel: injured being, panicked owner, limited time. "Get me scissors, the sharp ones, from the kitchen drawer," she snapped to Ruby, the old ER captain surfacing without thought. "Marcus, I need you to hold her head. Ethan, back up, now." They obeyed. Daisy cried and snapped once, teeth grazing Marcus's glove, but he kept his grip. Linda cut the wire, peeled it away from the torn skin, and wrapped the leg in clean gauze, hands moving with a speed that belied her years. When it was done, Daisy's breathing slowed. She licked Ethan's fingers, tail giving a faint thump. Ruby's eyes were wet. "That trap was up in the woods behind our place," she said shakily. "My brother-in-law's always setting those dang things. If that. Bobcat hadn't—" She broke off, looking out toward the yard. Rusty stood a little distance away, watching, chest rising and falling. For once there was no fear on Ruby's face when she met his gaze. Only something like awe. "I'll be damned," Marcus said softly. "He brought her to you." Linda met his eyes. For the first time since this all started, she saw his resistance crack. "This isn't just about food anymore," he said. "He knows you fix things." Rusty's ears flicked at the sound of their voices. He looked once more at Daisy, then at Linda, then turned and slipped silently back into the trees, leaving them all staring after him. The summer that followed came in dry and mean. By late June, the grass along Maple Ridge Road had gone from green to brittle straw. Leaves hung dull on the oaks. Every time Linda turned on the local news, somebody was talking about brush fires out west, about families sorting through ashes and fighting with their home insurance company over what counted as total loss. She'd find herself watching those interviews a little too closely, thinking how fast a lifetime of careful mortgage payments and retirement savings could turn into a blackened foundation and a stack of paperwork. Up here in Blue Ridge, they'd had a few small burns in the past, nothing serious. Still, she listened when Marcus mentioned red flag warnings and when a notice came in the mail about updating your emergency plan. She filled a plastic tote with copies of her life insurance policy, old photo albums, and a list of medications in case she ever had to evacuate on short notice. It felt melodramatic, like buying a burial plot before you were finished living, but she did it anyway. Rusty came and went with the easy confidence of something that finally belonged to the woods. Weeks would pass with no sign of him, but on the trail cams Marcus had helped her set up. Linda would see a sleek, muscled bobcat slipping through the trees at night, eyes glowing briefly as he checked the edge of her clearing. The patients continued to arrive from time to time, a limping raccoon, an owl with a torn wing. Sometimes Rusty appeared in the background of the footage, watching like a triage nurse making rounds. The fire that changed everything started with lightning. The storm barreled over the ridge one hot afternoon, all flash and fury, dumping more noise than rain. Linda was in the kitchen washing syringes when the power blipped, came back, and then a jagged crack split the sky so close it rattled the dishes in the cabinet. The lights flickered again. She smelled something sharp and wrong on the next gust of wind, not the usual wet earth, but a scorched, acrid tang. Her phone buzzed on the table, a shrill emergency alert tone that made her jump. She wiped her hands and picked it up. A banner glowed on the screen. Wildfire reported near Blue Ridge. High winds. Be ready to evacuate. She went to the porch. Over the tops of the trees, a gray-brown column was already rising, wide at the base and getting wider, darkening as it climbed. The wind, which usually came from the west, had turned. She could feel it on her face, hot and insistent, blowing straight toward Maple Ridge Road. Sirens wailed in the distance. A fire truck roared past the bottom of her drive, heading up the mountain. Her first stupid thought was of her electric bill and whether they'd charge her for power on days the lines were down. The second thought, brighter and truer, was of cages in her living room and small lives inside them. Inside, the house felt smaller, full of heartbeats. The kitten, now a lanky teenager with a crooked but functional leg, sat in a crate by the stove. The half-grown rabbit she was getting ready to release blinked at her from a pen near the door. A young opossum she'd taken in after a car strike clung to a flannel blanket in a laundry basket, beady eyes wide. The phone rang again. This time it was Ruby. "Linda, they're telling folks down at the Dollar General to get out," she said, voice high and thin. "Fires jumped the ridge. They say if you're on Maple, you need to go now." "I can't just leave these animals," Linda said, already yanking a heavy tote from under the table, mind skittering between who she could fit in her car and who she could carry. "They can't outrun fire." "You can't outrun it either," Ruby shot back. "Ethan and I are packing the car. You get what you can and get down the hill. Don't make me send somebody up there to drag you out." The call dropped. The signal bars on the phone blinked weakly, then disappeared altogether. "Of course," Linda muttered, "right when a girl could use a little 5G. She moved on muscle memory, file box with papers into the back seat. Cats in carriers. Crate doors open, then shut again with trembling fingers. She loaded the kitten and the rabbit into the back of her old sedan, the opossum wedged in on the floor. Every time she stepped onto the porch, the smell of smoke was stronger. Ash began to fall in soft gray flecks, dusting the rocker and the welcome mat where Rusty had once sat. As she went back in for another armload, the world outside the front window glowed an unnatural color. The sky had gone from blue to a flat, eerie orange. The far tree line wavered behind a curtain of smoke, as if the mountain itself were breathing hard. She heard a car horn blaring, frantic, somewhere down the hill. Then a child's voice, thin and shaking. "Mrs. Parker, Mrs. Parker." She froze. Ethan. He burst up onto the porch a moment later, face streaked with soot, eyes huge. "Grandma told me to get in the car," he panted. "But Daisy ran off when the siren started, and I went after her, and then I couldn't see her, and—" Linda grabbed his shoulders. "Is Ruby still at the house?" He shook his head, tears tracking through the ash on his cheeks. "She thought I was in the back seat." They drove off. Then the smoke came, and I couldn't see the road. I didn't know where else to go. "Okay," Linda said, forcing calm into her voice while the back of her neck prickled with fear. "Okay, honey, you did the right thing coming here." A fresh gust of wind slammed against the side of the house, hot enough to sting. Somewhere behind the ridge, something big collapsed with a roar. Embers, tiny and bright, floated in the air now like fireflies from another world. She looked at her packed car, at the animals inside, at Ethan's small hand gripping her robe. The road down the hill was already lost in smoke. If they drove blind into that, one wrong turn could send them into a ditch, or worse. Her mind unhelpfully supplied images of hospital beds and medical bills, of people maxing out credit cards to pay for burns and broken bones. "Change of plan," she said. "We wait for help. There'll be crews coming up. They know the back roads." As if answering her, the fire gave a low, hungry roar. A line of flame licked the top of the nearest ridge, running from tree to tree like someone tipping over a row of matches. The air in the yard went from hot to suffocating. Smoke pressed in, thick and choking. Ethan started to cough, eyes streaming. The kitten mewed from the car, a high, panicked sound. "Back inside," she ordered. "Wet this and hold it over your mouth." She thrust a damp dish towel at him, grabbed one for herself. Training said, "Get low, stay out of the worst of the smoke." Instinct said, "Run." Something moved at the edge of the yard, a darker shadow against gray. For one wild second she thought it was a firefighter. Then it stepped into view, and her heart lurched. Rusty. He stood between the house and the tree line, fur bristling, whiskers singed at the tips. His sides heaved with each breath. He looked smaller against that wall of smoke, but there was nothing uncertain in his stance. His eyes found her through the haze, and she saw the same steady, almost impatient look he'd worn on the porch the first morning he'd come for help. He let out a sound she'd never heard from him before, loud, harsh, almost like a bark. Then he turned and bounded toward the far side of the property, not uphill toward the flames, not down toward the smothered road, but sideways, skirting the slope. He ran a dozen yards, then stopped and looked back, tail lashing. When she didn't move, he trotted back a few steps, called out again, then repeated the pattern. Away, back, away. Ethan tugged her sleeve. "He wants us to follow," the boy said, voice small behind the towel. Linda looked at the thickening smoke rolling toward them, at the angry rim of fire picking its way down through the treetops, at her car loaded with lives she didn't want to lose. Every sensible part of her knew this was insane. You didn't follow wild animals into the woods with a child and a backseat full of cages. Then she remembered Rusty dropping Daisy, hurt and trapped, on her mat. The rabbit, the bird, the way he'd sat and watched until she stepped in. Somewhere along the way, they'd made a bargain she hadn't fully understood. "All right," she said. "Okay, everybody out of the car. We're walking." Ethan didn't question it. He grabbed the kitten's crate with both hands. Linda hefted the opossum and the rabbit, grunting at the weight. The air scorched her throat as soon as she stepped off the porch. Rusty moved the instant they did, trotting ahead, but never so far that they lost sight of him. He led them around the side of the house, past the old shed and the rusted water tank, toward a tangle of scrub she'd never had reason to push through. There, half hidden by years of fallen branches and leaf litter, was a narrow game trail angling down across the slope. She would never have seen it on her own. The entrance was only a bobcat wide. Rusty slipped into it, then turned back, ears flat, as if to say, "Hurry." Linda took a breath that tasted like ash, tightened her grip on the cages, and followed. The trail zigzagged down under low branches and between rocks, always just enough space for her shoulders and the boy's narrow frame. The smoke thinned a little in the hollow, caught above them in the canopy. Once, Ethan stumbled on a root and nearly went to his knees. Rusty doubled back, circling them with a low, anxious growl until they were moving again. They walked like that for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Behind them, the hillside roared and popped, a beast devouring everything in its path. Ahead, Linda began to hear new sounds, voices shouting, engines idling, the crackle of radios. The trail spat them out at last onto a wider dirt road she recognized dimly as an old logging track. Parked along it were 2 fire engines, a sheriff's SUV, and a line of pickup trucks. Men and women in yellow Nomex and hard hats turned in surprise as an elderly woman, a boy, a bobcat, and a collection of cages burst out of the brush like some strange evacuation drill gone wrong. A firefighter hurried toward them. "Ma'am, you okay?" "You folks from up on Maple Ridge?" "We are," she croaked, pulling the towel from her mouth. "House on the end. Linda Parker. This is Ethan Jenkins. His grandmother went down ahead. We've been trying to get back up there to check that last house," the firefighter said. "Road's blocked by a downed tree. How'd you get through?" Linda looked back at the trail, already half swallowed again by smoke and shadow. Rusty stood at its mouth, sides heaving, looking utterly, perfectly at home. "A friend showed us a back way," she said. Another firefighter raised a phone, hands trembling only slightly, and snapped a photo of the bobcat standing there with flames painting the ridge behind him. Later, that picture and video from a helmet cam that caught a glimpse of Rusty trotting ahead of them on the trail would bounce around the internet under headlines about a hero bobcat leading people and animals out of danger. Folks would share it between stories about car insurance claims and fundraisers to help families rebuild, typing words like miracle and angel in the comments. Right then, though, it was just Linda, coughing smoke out of her lungs, watching the wild animal who had once scratched at her door turn away without ceremony and melt back into the burning woods as if saving them had been just another item on his daily rounds. The fire never did reach her house. It burned hot and fast along the ridge, chewed through old brush and a stand of pines, then moved on when the wind shifted and the rain finally came. From the church parking lot where evacuees camped out on cots, Linda watched the smoke trail thin to a smudge. 3 days later, a deputy drove her and Ruby and Ethan back up Maple Ridge to see what was left. There were black scars on the hillside, places where the forest looked like a burned photograph. But the little house at the end of the road still stood, paint blistered on one side, a few shingles missing, porch rails streaked with ash. The for sale sign at the sad little cabin 2 bends down was nothing but a twisted metal post. Linda's welcome mat was gray with soot, but there were no cracks in the glass, no yellow tape across the door. Her home insurance agent would later call it a near miss, and talk about how lucky she was that her coverage was up to date. He used words like deductible, replacement cost, and additional living expenses, and for once she listened. It was one thing to hear about disasters on the news between ads for life insurance and low-interest credit cards. It was another to smell your own walls singe. In the weeks that followed, Maple Ridge changed in ways big and small. Fire crews cleared brush and cut new brake lines. Some neighbors decided one close call was enough and put their places on the market, asking prices higher than any local hardware clerk or Dollar General cashier could hope to pay. New folks came through with SUVs and second home dreams, asking about internet speed and whether the cell service would support their remote work. What didn't change was the quiet knock of the woods at Linda's back door. The story of the bobcat spread faster than any real estate listing. The helmet cam clip of Rusty trotting ahead on the game trail ran on the local evening news, then on a regional cable channel wedged between segments about rising Medicare costs and how to lower your credit card debt. Somebody posted it online with dramatic music laid over the smoke and flames. Comments rolled in from strangers. "Angels come in all shapes. God uses even wild creatures. I hope that lady has good life insurance after all that." A small-town reporter came up to do a feature. She wanted footage of the hero cat, but Rusty, true to his nature, declined to appear on cue. Linda offered her coffee and showed her the trail instead. The woman filmed the charred stumps and the soot-darkened bark and asked questions about what it was like to be led out of danger by something most people would call a threat. "I just followed the one who knew the way," Linda said. "Same as I did for 30 years in the ER. You learn to trust whoever actually understands what's going on." Somewhere amid all the excitement, someone, Marcus swore it wasn't him, filled out a grant application with Linda's name on it. A few months later, a modest check and a certificate arrived from a wildlife foundation congratulating Maple Ridge Wildlife Rescue on official recognition as a small rehabilitation partner. The name made her laugh and then unexpectedly cry. "It's just my living room," she told Marcus when he brought over a laminated sign with the same words, and a beat-up shed full of old towels. "It's more than that," he said. "You've been doing the work for free. Might as well let the state help with the feed bill." Word went out quietly among the vets and rangers and the sheriff's office. If a fawn got clipped by a car on a back road, if someone found a nest of baby possums after a tree fell, if a hawk showed up on a porch railing with a wing held at a bad angle, they'd call ahead and bring it to the little house at the end of Maple Ridge. Linda kept a ledger now, not of copays and insurance authorizations, but of intake dates and release notes. It felt strange and sweet to have a waiting room full of critters instead of people. Megan shook her head on video calls. "You always did need a full plate," she said, watching her mother syringe feed a squirrel while they talked. "Just promise me you're not putting vet bills on a credit card, okay?" "I've got a small retirement account and a refrigerator door full of coupons," Linda answered. "And some help from the state. Don't you worry. If I go broke, it won't be because of a raccoon with a cold." Through it all, Rusty stayed mostly a rumor. He appeared on the trail cams now and then, by himself, or slipping through the edge of the frame behind a deer. Sometimes she'd find his tracks on the old game trail, big and clear beside those of foxes and coyotes. Once, on a soft evening in late summer, she thought she saw him at the far edge of the clearing, watching while she let a now healthy rabbit bolt from an open crate. When she blinked, he was gone. Life settled into a new rhythm. The house that had seemed too quiet when she first moved in was now full of noise. The rustle of cages, the clink of stainless bowls, the ring of the phone when someone needed advice on a stray they'd picked up. Linda slept deeply and woke early, not because of dread, but because there was always something to tend to. Years have their own way of passing whether you pay attention or not. One winter morning she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and saw more white in her hair and more lines around her mouth than she remembers. Her knees ached more on cold days. The Medicare card in her wallet saw more use for her own checkups. But her hands stayed steady when she wrapped bandages, and her eyes were still good enough to spot a tick in thick fur. It was on one of those mornings in the thin gray light between night and day that she woke with that old familiar feeling of being watched. It wasn't the prickly dread from the fire, nor the alertness of an ER page. It was something quieter, a nudge. She shrugged into her robe and padded to the front door, heart ticking a little faster without her permission. The house cats chirped and swirled around her feet as if they felt it too. She eased the curtain back and peered out. At first all she saw was fog. It lay over the yard in a soft sheet, muffling the shapes of the rocker and the rail. Then the mist shifted, and 3 figures came into focus at the edge of the porch light's reach. Rusty stood 10 feet from the steps, big and solid, his coat thick against the cold. Scars she had not treated marked one ear and a stripe along his shoulder. He looked every inch what he was, a mature bobcat in his prime, as much a part of these mountains as the stones under the soil. On either side of him, slightly behind, were 2 smaller shapes. Kittens, she corrected herself automatically, though they were nearly as tall as her house cats already, lanky legs and oversized paws, spots crisp against their winter coats. They bobbed their heads nervously, testing the air. One of them lifted its nose and sniffed in the direction of the house, whiskers twitching. Linda opened the door slowly. The cold touched her face, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and something wild and clean. She stepped onto the porch, hands loose at her sides. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "You brought company." Rusty's ears flicked. He didn't come forward, didn't set a paw on the steps. Instead, he held his ground, eyes on her face. The kittens shifted, clearly curious but anchored by their father's stillness. She took a careful step down, her slippers whispering against the wood. Her chest felt tight and full, as if there wasn't quite enough room for all the things she wanted to say. "Thank you. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry I ever thought you were just a problem on my porch." "You did all right out there," she murmured. "Found your own job." One of the kittens made a small, questioning sound. Rusty's tail flicked, and they pressed closer to his sides. For a heartbeat, the four of them, woman, cat, and two small echoes, shared the thin morning air. She didn't reach out. The rules still held. He was not hers to touch. "You don't need me anymore," she said. "That's the best kind of goodbye, you know." He blinked slowly once. Then, with the same unhurried certainty he'd shown the first morning he chose her porch, Rusty turned. The kittens followed. The three bobcats walked back into the fog and the trees, their shapes fading until there was only the rustle of undergrowth and finally nothing at all. Linda stood there on the steps until the cold made her knees complain. When she went back inside, the house felt full, not of ghosts, but of a long, unlikely story that had finally found its ending. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table as the sun climbed over the blackened ridge. On the wall above the stove, the laminated Maple Ridge Wildlife Rescue sign caught the light. Below it, her old hospital badge hung on a nail, the photo of a younger woman in scrubs slightly faded. She thought of all the mornings before the bobcat, when she'd woken up certain that the part of her life that mattered most was over. She thought of the feel of a desperate little body on her porch, the heat of infection under her hands, the way his eyes had told her, without words, that she was still the one person in the room who could change what happened next. "I thought I rescued you," she said into the quiet kitchen, not sure who she was talking to anymore. "Turns out you were the one who came knocking for me." Outside, a breeze ruffled the ash-gray grass. Somewhere up on the ridge, a bobcat called, a rough, short yowl, answered faintly by a smaller voice. Linda smiled, wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, and let herself simply sit and listen, grateful that in this late chapter of her life, something wild had come to her front door each morning until she finally let it in. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.